So I'm bringing to you Mr. David Hawkins, who is the Chief Education and Policy Officer for the National Association for College Admission Counseling. We call it NACAC. And he is sharing information, as you saw in the invitation. He's sharing information from a very important but dense report called Toward a More Equitable Future for Post-Secondary Access. This is really critical. This is going to be a serious tool for your toolbox. And I want you to tune in because this is part one of a two-part series for your toolbox. This is how you are helping young people move on to their level of success. So I'm excited to bring to you David Hawkins. It is for you, David.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be able to talk about the report that we issued back in January, particularly because, as I mentioned during the pre-call conversation that I was having this morning, this report very intentionally raises more questions than it answers, and that is, you'll see why we did that as we go through the presentation. So title screen, don't need to spend time on that. Report. I think what's important to note about the report itself is how it came about. And that is that in late 2020, we saw an opportunity, given everything that happened through that year, in the domain of racial justice or injustice, as the case really was, that there was a moment, and you'll hear us talk at NACAC a lot about meeting the moment with our advocacy and our policy work, and we really felt very strongly that we had a moment to address racial equity and college admission plus financial aid. And so the Lumina Foundation felt the same way. We're grateful to them for that, and they funded a project where NACAC and NASFAA, if you're not familiar with NASFAA, it's the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, took a look at really what I would call more the nuts and bolts of what we do, and maybe not quite the nuts and bolts of very specific processes and procedures in an office, but really take a look at the process and look at it through a racial equity lens. So the Lumina Foundation was very generous to support our effort to look at that. Before we get into the findings, I thought it might be helpful to take a moment to reflect on some of what we learned about the project itself, about the process of going through this project, because it actually had an impact on the outcome. The first thing, of course, I mentioned the partnership. So I just, I think one of the things that's important about this work is that it is actually the voices of the admission professionals and the financial aid professionals saying these things. I think to a lot of people that I talk to on an individual level and groups, perhaps like this one, a lot of the issues in the report may not feel like they're groundbreaking or earth-shattering or brand new or anything like that. But what struck us as being very important about this report is that this is the profession itself coming forward and being honest and candid about its origins, about its structures, about its processes and policies. And I think there's something to be said for a group of people that comes out and admits, listen, there's a lot that we do that's affected by systemic racism. There's a history, there's an embedded cultural phenomenon, there are inequities that feed into the system, but there are also inequities embedded in the system. And I think that's what we felt was really important to capture about the partnership between these two organizations. So we appointed a thought leadership panel that included professionals and experts from within the professions, but also around the profession. We had a couple of college presidents on the panel. We had people who run who are vendors in our space, who help create the infrastructure that is college admission counseling. We had the head of it, college advising for the New York City Public Schools on the panel, and a lot of other people to try to just get a glimpse of this process from a bunch of different angles. We wanted clearly the bulk of it to be from the professional, the practitioner perspective, but we wanted to have also representation from the communities that surround the process. Another important element was we went by the nothing about us without us rule, where we didn't want to purport to talk about what was good for students without talking to the students themselves. And that turned out to be a really, really critical part of the project, as you would imagine. We interviewed, I want to say between 15 and 20 students of color, did in-depth interviews with them about their journey. And we were careful to get prospective students, current students, and students who had already completed, because we wanted to capture each perspective on the process itself. And as I said, their stories really formed the basis of the recommendations that come out of this report. So when we do talk about the recommendations, and as a professional perhaps that's very involved in this process, you might look at it and go, huh, that seems like pretty general, maybe common sensey, maybe obvious. But when you think about where they came from, these were fundamentally student voices that were saying to us, please do this, please do these things on our behalf. And the thought leadership panel reflecting on those and go, we could do a better job of this, and we do need to frame these questions in a way that institutions can begin to operationalize some of these ideas. And as we looked at the project, we were trying to think about what's going to distinguish this project from so many other projects, so many other research reports, committee processes, things like that talk about equity and college access. And the one thing that we hadn't seen as much of was someone sort of taking a design approach, like really looking at this to say, if you had to fundamentally design this for equity, how would you do it differently? What kinds of things would you be looking at? And again, when you think about that from the student perspective, in essence, some of these recommendations that we ended up coming up with kind of turn the current admission process 180 degrees. They sort of from a more institutionally focused approach to the more student focused approach. And that's kind of where NACAC wants to be in general, but I think that's where we as a policy community, as a practice community, need to also try to move towards. And in keeping with that, the recommendations we provided were aimed at 3 different levels. The first level was practitioners, things that we could control as admission officers and financial aid officers. We had also a set of recommendations for institutional leaders, because if you've ever worked in college admission, you know that contrary to public opinion that admission officers are all knowing and all seeing and all powerful, they in fact have very little power over a lot of institutional policy. And that's a point of frustration, in fact, for a lot of our admissions members, that they can't just wave a wand or flip a switch and make something happen. You have to go through layers upon layers of governance, administrators, college presidents, trustees, legislators, alumni, you name it. There's just a lot of cooks in that kitchen, so to speak. And then I mentioned the project was funded by Lumina Foundation. Lumina in general is very, very oriented towards equity. And that is something that we greatly appreciate as a foundation, as someone who's positioned to make this kind of difference. But we also appreciate their individual support for our project. And as I'll mention at the end of the presentation, there are many, many irons in the fire, and Lumina is very engaged and interested in the follow-up to this report. So that's a little bit of the background about the project. I'll encourage, if anybody has questions, it's tough for me immediately to see the chat based on how my computer's set up. So if anybody has questions, please do jump in. Don't be shy about interrupting me. I might continue talking for a second, but I do want to hear your questions. And of course, we'll leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions as well.
David, we're also monitoring the chat.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So anytime there's a question, I'm happy to address it. So here was a first recommendation. And this one was one, again, I mentioned that there were some observations about the project itself that really fed into the recommendations. And the very first recommendation we make in the report is that we feel in order to create and sustain progress in the area of racial equity. And let me say this project was focused on racial equity. This was not the broader equity that we often, that is certainly meritorious and it's very important to talk about, but this really was focused on racial equity. So I want to just be clear at the outset that that's what, when I talk about equity throughout, you can assume that I'm talking for now about racial equity. One of the most important things that we discovered about this project is that it's important for people to be able to lift themselves out of the daily grind in order to think about this in a more careful way and think about what they're doing and engage with students. Because one of the things that happened during the project, it was very clear very quickly that even at this high level of expertise of these people that we had on this thought leadership panel, and this is not to cast them in any negative light at all, because this was an amazing group of people and they realized this about themselves. So this is why they were so, I think it was so refreshing to work with them. I'll give you an example. When we first started, people started talking about, well, you know, we need to have classes in high schools. Students should have a class in their senior year about how to do the college application process. And I'm thinking in the back of my head, okay, those exist in some places already. And then someone said, well, we should really start them in the junior year. And I thought, okay, well, yes, that's right. And then someone else came and said, we should start these classes in kindergarten. You know, they should have this information all along. And I just had to stop. I said, okay, let me ask a question here. Are we really saying right now that we should spend as much time on a process that takes that occupies a sort of a finite place in anybody's life? Are we saying we should spend as much time on that as math or writing? I said, one of the things that I want to be careful is that we don't try to conform students to the system necessarily, but how about if we turn it around and look to the other end of the lens? What if we conform the system to the students instead? And then they realized, they were like, okay, I see what we're doing here. So even at this very expert group of people, we started out thinking, how do we help the students through the system as it is? And that's not what we were trying to do with this report. So it was really important. It ended up being very important for us to say out loud and in the report that in order for institutions, policymakers, practitioners to really commit to this issue, they have to commit to setting aside time each year regularly to think about testing their assumptions. What are we doing? How is this really, are we creating inequities? Are we sustaining inequities? Are we making progress towards equity? And one of the really important elements of this, and this is another cross-cutting recommendation, is that students need to be involved in those conversations. You have to get the students' input. And that, that again, to us sounds really obvious, but it was a big challenge trying to get everybody up on that level during this project. And everyone agreed that at their institutions, there is very little space for this because you're always so caught up in the day-to-day and you're caught up in what is and invested in what is and not necessarily what could be. So that was the first recommendation. And then we get really into the meat of the report. Today I'll be talking mostly about the admissions side of the recommendations because NASFAA isn't here to talk about theirs, and I don't want to misrepresent theirs, but I do have a slide at the end that goes over theirs. But one of the things that was really evident as we talked to both the students and the panel, and pardon me if I'm looking over this way, I've got my slide up on another screen here, but we stated in the report that there was a fundamental tension between selectivity and equity. And I'm of course mindful that there are a lot of very selective colleges that try very hard, and some do a good job of trying to achieve some form of equity within their highly selective context. But when you really boil it all down, the history of college admission as it is currently set up in this country is defined by exclusion. The whole idea of being selective is that it began, I should say, began with an original intent to, let's just call it what it is, to discriminate. And that went through a lot of different iterations throughout the history of college admission over the past century. But we wanted to make sure that, again, we all sort of know this, I think, but we wanted to say to the world, we acknowledge that the structures upon which we rest our current practice are built on a foundation that was originally flawed. And so if we hope to create lasting change in the area of racial equity, we need to go back to those original foundations and understand, geez, have they set us off on a course that we just can't do what we want to do with equity without somehow going back and recasting those foundations. So that that was something that was very important for us to say to the world. And then I think we wanted to also broach that ever difficult topic of what so many people seem to think is a very clearly defined notion of merit. We felt like that these concepts were ripe for challenge. There's so much more that we know today about student capabilities and student skills and student intelligences that our old system of merit, being as it is built on a foundation that was already designed to be exclusive and exclusionary, just compounds the problems, the equity problems related to selectivity. So as we thought about how do we improve that design, we started to think about why institutions need to really ask themselves why they are exclusive. Why do we decide to reject people? What does that mean for us? And I particularly, when you talk about public and private colleges, inevitably you get into some different conversations about who they are, what rights they have to self sort of determination. So probably one of the first things that we're going to tackle in the follow up to this is the question about state institutions. Why are public institutions selective? On what basis are they selective? And I think that again, you can come up with reasons why. You could suggest that, well, the curriculum we offer at this institution requires a certain degree of academic, accomplishment in high school. Totally get that. So let's say you set a somewhat reasonable floor for if a student hasn't reached these levels in these courses, then they're going to have a tough time succeeding here. Beyond that, then what criteria are you using to make those decisions? And if you're a public institution, do those criteria stand up to your public obligations to the taxpayers of your state? So as you can kind of see, that's a big question that's going to take some time to really get into. But we really wanted to jump out and say that there is something fundamentally problematic about selectivity and equity. It's not that you can't be equitable in some way, but when you choose to be more selective, you're also choosing to be less equitable in many ways, and you have to you'd have to work that much harder to get to your equity goals. So I think just in terms of summarizing the recommendations, we obviously think there is a role for the admission office to play in starting the conversation on campus about selectivity. I think some of you might have seen recently the Wall Street Journal and a couple of other papers reported on some of the Ivy Leagues that are now sort of not reporting their selectivity rates, their acceptance rates. I kind of want to think that might have been from an internal conversation related to this, which is that what purpose does it serve to talk about how selective we are? And I'm not naive. I know exactly what purpose it serves. But if you're talking about the larger institutional mission, what if we're honest with ourselves and we say, well, we're selective because we want to be perceived as the best. Well, what's your definition of the best? And are you serving a public purpose with that? Are you serving equity goals with that? Are you reinforcing social structures that are already rife with systemic racism, among other types of systemic problems? But let's just, for now, just keep it at that. So we really think that between the admission office and the institutional leadership, there is a reconciliation that needs to happen. That I think we need to re-examine selectivity and why it's something that we value as higher education, because it really doesn't, from an objective point of view. So the rate at which you reject students says really nothing about the quality of education at your institution. And worse, it has implications for excluding people based on a whole pyramid of systemic problems. So that's something we feel is really, really important. And we want policymakers thinking about that too, particularly for state-supported institutions. I think we really do have some questions about why public flagships get to reject so many students, why systems aren't set up necessarily in all states to account for the large number of students who could benefit from public four-year higher education. And these questions are relevant for private institutions as well. We'd want them thinking about the same things. The college application process, again, I'm gonna go through some of these a little more quickly because I realize how much I'm getting into some of the weeds, but I feel like it's important to talk a little bit about how we see this playing out, because otherwise this seems maybe a little bit, ambiguous and amorphous in its shape. But to put it simply, in this day and age, when we go on to Amazon or we go on to Netflix or what have you, and we can choose from all manner of different choices, and the system seems to know a heck of a lot more about us than we even know about ourselves, why is it the case that we're making students replicate the records that they've built up over the years, deliver information, even if it's just through one portal like the Common App, and shove that all off to colleges when the technology exists to basically say, geez, I'm interested in that college, push a button and your transcripts are gone, your information is there, everything theoretically that an institution would need to evaluate you as an applicant could theoretically be there at the touch of a button. So why is all of this still there? And this is, again, this was really grounded in what our students were telling us. Why is it the case that we have to jump through all of these extra hoops when we've spent, 13 years of our lives developing an academic record that really is the single sort of all the factors that we look at, is the single most powerful predictor of success in college in any event. So we really felt like there were ways in which institutions, leaders, and policymakers could think about application differently. We know, for instance, in Idaho, of all places, if you graduate from an Idaho public high school, you're guaranteed admission to a Idaho public college. And there's other policies like that around the country, but the process in Idaho is literally that easy. You don't have to apply. You are accepted. There is, I'm sure, some sort of small sort of process you have to go through, but nothing like what we ask students to do at colleges now. Another thing that we featured in the report, there was a partnership that was announced last year, between EAB, which is one of the big companies that's involved in helping colleges recruit students, and a company called Concourse. And Concourse basically goes into high schools and allows the schools to upload their students' information to this system. And the colleges on the back end are able to view the students. And the only way in which a college can reach out to one of the students in the system is to offer them a spot at their college. So in essence, all the student has to do is make sure the information in the system is consistent with what is theirs, their address, their name, all that good stuff. And the only thing they'll hear from a college is you're accepted. So it's a really innovative and potentially revolutionary system. And actually the partnership, Concourse allows the schools to do that. The partnership with EAB was to actually institute this with a number of CBOs in Chicago. And so these CBOs now also have the capacity, just as a school would, to upload their students' information, and the colleges can see them. And of course, there is partnership with the school to make sure that the information is complete. But that's an example. That's not the only thing that can be done, but it's an example of how I think we can short circuit the application process and make it so much easier for students. And that has a lot of equity implications to it, because again, the students we talked to said that there was just so much about the college application process that seems so obvious to their classmates who came from white upper income families, that to them was just, and you know, not all of these students we talked to were from lower income families. Some of them were from very well-to-do families, in fact. But there was just points along the way that the process felt alien to them. And it was really important to hear that and to be able to integrate it into this set of recommendations. The next section of the report dealt with how we made admission decisions. And this was very much a hybrid between the thought leadership panel and what the students were telling us. Generally speaking, the students were encouraging us to really lean on what they've done in high school. You know, think of all of the things that students do in high school, from class projects to essays, papers, to projects that they're involved in with the school, to volunteer opportunities. It's all right there in the school's records. And they basically said every extra hoop we have to jump through is another barrier for us. And so we felt that, you know, one of the challenges that we face as an admission profession is that a lot of the factors that we consider in the admission process are in some ways received wisdom. You know, as I said earlier, these systems tended to be built in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and they've been fundamentally just sort of, there's been an additive quality where they've just been sort of built it and adapted over time rather than fundamentally redesigned. So a lot of schools are operating on what we would consider received wisdom. And I'll give you an example. And Crystal, I think you've heard this because this was all done while you were here at NACAC, but with standardized testing. We did a survey back in 2016 of colleges that required admission tests for students. And of the colleges that require tests, only about 50% of them did what we call predictive validity research to understand whether the tests said anything about whether the students would succeed at their institution. And that was an eye-opener for us, because we felt like if you require tests, and let's expand that out to whatever you require for admission, you probably ought to know whether those things that you're asking students to give you have any meaning in terms of whether the student's going to succeed. So if institutions do require tests and they do the research, and that research says, yes, it tells us something meaningful about whether students can succeed in the environment that we have, thumbs up, right? But if you require tests and you don't do the research, and therefore you don't know whether they give you anything, then the question is, why are you requiring them? And that goes for any factor in the process. Why are you requiring this thing that students perceive as a barrier and they get very stressed out about and they oftentimes have difficulty with? So we really want institutions to scrutinize everything they do, to really think about what it is we're asking for and why we're asking for it. Not just that because we've always done it that way, or not just because that's how the Ivy League does it, or et cetera, et cetera. And likewise, we want people at every level, because quite frankly, with state institutions, which serve the large majority of our students in this country, we want them to be looking at this too. And that's going to happen at the policy level often. There are requirements that originate in state legislatures, that admission officers and even college presidents are powerless to unilaterally change. We also think that even something as simple and sacred as the high school record is ripe for rethinking, because things like GPA and the A through F grading scale are starting to, I think, be outpaced by one of the other things we mentioned in the report, which was performance assessments. And those are much more, if you're not familiar with them already, there are much more robust ways of evaluating students when they're in high school, because what they do is they give them complex tasks, complex projects to work on, and then the students get to demonstrate multiple skills, multiple talents as they go through this work. So not only are you looking at whether a student gets the subject matter at the end of the day, you're also looking at how they got there. So one method might work for one student, whereas that method might not work for the other, but the other student gets it a different way. And so what it allows you to do is it allows you to provide a lot more contextual information about this student will get it. And they particularly get it because they're good at X skill. They're good at doing in-depth statistical research, for instance, or they're very good at doing qualitative studies, or they're very good at public presentation. They're very good at building connections in a network. So there's lots of ways in which this information could be fed into the admissions process. And that's something that NACAC, in fact, has been working on over the last 5 years. So we really want to think very differently about what we're asking students for, or what we expect to see of students, I should say, and why it's there, what it contributes to colleges, universities' understanding of the student body. The last admission-related point here is that the admission staff came up as a big point of conversation with the students. And what's interesting is we had actually done a study back in 2014 and found that the demographics of admission office were predominantly white, that they were less diverse than the student body of four-year colleges, which in itself is less diverse than the population of traditional age students in this country. So you've got a sort of, you ultimately, because the admission office serves oftentimes as the face of the institution, you want students to be able to see themselves in the process, wherever they come from. You want them to be able to see someone that's, oh, look, I am represented here. And in fact, that's what the students told us. They said things from, they were intimidated by admission offices that looked and felt so very different from them. They had conversations with admission officers that were unsettling, where admission officers felt either just didn't understand what the students were telling them, or expected the students to come to them with some sort of trauma story. And I know we've all heard this before, but the idea that somehow a student of color should necessarily present a trauma perspective it's just wrong in so many different ways, that the students said, that when there's that expectation, it creates a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of a stifling effect. That students of color felt very hesitant to even initiate conversations because of the expectations. So there was a lot that went into this conversation, and the long and short of it is we need to do a better job of diversifying the admission office. And I want to say to the admission folks that are out there who have been working on this for a long time and who are professionals of color, the situation has improved greatly over the last couple of decades, but there's still a long way to go. And I think that's something that NACAC is very interested in working on and uniquely positioned to do, of course, with our partners in the field. So we really want to make sure that we're working very hard to diversify the admission office, and then provide the kinds of training that will help eliminate racial and ethnic bias, among other things, in the process. So I've sort of already talked through some of the recommendations in each of these areas. So the one additional thing, of course, here, and this goes through all of the recommendations, is it's so important to create space to listen to students. This is something that became very apparent, and that I think needs to happen at all levels: the admissions office, the institutional leadership, and public policymakers. So really just quickly, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Last couple of slides here. Number one, the financial aid recommendations that NASFAA put forward were really focused on simplification of the financial aid process. And then, of course, they also had done some recent work in implicit bias in the financial aid office. And they came out with a report and a new professional development program to help address implicit bias in the financial aid processes. So I'll let their sections of the report speak for themselves, because, like I said, they're not here, and I don't want to misrepresent anything. But needless to say, when you put this all together as a package, I think there's a lot of territory here to go over, and a lot of questions to ask of what we do. So my last substantive slide here is just to let you know that this report is a starting point for us. We do not see this as having crossed some sort of finish line, and we've actually just started the race.